I want to welcome everyone to Introduction to Data Management and Clinical Research, taught at Wake Technical Community College here in Raleigh. My name is Steve Pope. I'll be your instructor. The course will last 8 weeks. It'll be taught online using Moodle. There will be 3 in-class labs that will be conducted over at the Beltline Center here in Raleigh. I'll give you a little more information about those as we move along, but we want to use this time to kind of get oriented to the course so that you know what to expect, and so you'll know what to do each week as you get online and start digging through the information. The online platform that we're going to be using is going to be Moodle. Many of you have used Moodle before if you've taken classes here at Wake Tech. So a couple things that you need to be aware of when using Moodle. You'll discover that Google Chrome works best. Also Mozilla works pretty well with it. So make sure you're using one of those 2 browsers as you're using Moodle. Make sure that you have an email address that's not an email address with the domain of waketech.edu. Those email domains don't work very well with our online environment, specifically in the continuing education program. So make sure that you've got an email address that either uses Gmail or Yahoo, or maybe you might want to use your work email. Whatever you want to do is fine, but stay away from the waketech.edu email domain. So what I'll do is I'll post the assignments for the week on Moodle each week. They'll be available Monday morning at 1 a.m. So you'll be able to see them first thing Monday morning. There'll be a topic page on there. It'll be oriented by week. So it'll be week 1, week 2, week 3, and then it will have whatever the topic for that week is going to be. So you'll have a module page on there that'll contain some instructions and some kind of getting started information. There'll be a video lecture that'll be on YouTube, so you can listen to that, you can look at that. Those will run anywhere from maybe 35 or 40 minutes, maybe up to about 50-55 minutes. And there may be more than one, depending on what our topic is for that week. And then if you need help with Moodle, there's a link right there on the slide that you can use to get help if you need it. So let's take a look at our syllabus for the course. If you'll notice up at the top, you've got the course section number, which is 145430 for the fall semester. And you'll probably need that number if you have to communicate with anyone there at Wake Tech about the class. Put that in the subject line of your email. But as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have, it'll be taught online using Moodle. We'll also have 3 in-classroom labs, and those are listed there. The dates and times are listed there. So make sure you get those on your calendar, and then I've also included the location and the room number there at the Beltline Center at Wake Tech. If there's any change in that, I'll let you know via an announcement on Moodle, which will come through to your email as well. So a couple of things to go over here. First of all, I want to talk about the textbook. The textbook that we're going to be using is going to be Practical Guide to Clinical Data Management, Suzanne Prochka. You can find that on Amazon. You can find it on a number of different sites. Some of the new versions are probably, they may be $120. You can probably find some used ones for a little less than that. But you will need to get the textbook, so please go ahead and get that, because the reading that you do each week from the textbook actually supplements what I cover in the lectures. So I want to make sure that you have that as you go along. So continuing on with our syllabus, we've got some of the assessments that we're doing. As you can see, they're on page 3, and I'm not going to go into those in a whole lot of detail because we'll cover them during the course of the course. couple things that you do need to be aware of. There will be a midterm exam. There'll also be a final exam. The midterm exam you'll be able to do on Moodle. It'll be a 25 question multiple choice exam. It'll be open book. You'll have a couple chances to go through it. You will need to get 80% of the answers or questions answered correctly, which no one will have any problem doing it. The way to prepare yourself is that for each week we'll have a series of learning objectives that may be 3 or 4 for that week, and your questions will come directly from those. So as long as you know what those are, you won't have any trouble answering the questions correctly. The final exam will be a 50 question multiple choice questions. It'll also be on Moodle, and it'll be in the very same format. In fact, you may even see some of the exact same questions from the midterm that'll be on the final exam. So be prepared for that. So during this first week, a couple of things we want to get done. There'll be a discussion forum out there on Moodle where I'd like for you to introduce yourself to the class. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I'll go over that in a little more detail here in just a moment. But I do want you to go ahead and get that done within the next day or so. And then a couple things to kind of be familiar with. I like to kind of give a little pretest here. For example, the first question is, what is a CRF? The CRF is a case report form, and it's the principal instrument that we use to collect data during a clinical trial. So we'll talk in a lot more detail about that. You'll become very familiar with what those are during the course as we go along. Also, if any of you have ever participated in a clinical trial, you might want to share some of your experience with that. A lot of people haven't. But if you have and are able to share some of that with the class, that would be great. And then finally, explain what a principal investigator is. Most people don't know what that is, but a principal investigator is a doctor, a physician that conducts a trial at a specific clinical site. It could be one of the big academic medical centers such as Duke or UNC or the Mayo Clinic or whomever, but it could be at an individual doctor's office or at a private clinic someplace. So at any rate, we'll go over the syllabus here. I think I've covered most of the details, but if you have any questions about that, certainly let me know. But I don't think anyone will have any difficulty with that. Continuing on with our syllabus, I want to go over to page 9 in your syllabus, which is where the course outline begins. And as you'll see, I've got this broken out in weekly segments. So if you'll notice in the first week, I've tried to give you some details as far as what is going to be going on in the class during that week. So for this first week, we're going to go over our syllabus, and we'll talk about some of the assignments that we're going to do, a few of the classroom logistics, which I've already gone over some of those. And then also as we move along, we'll talk about the various phases that take place in a clinical trial, and then some of the roles that some of the people associated with that trial are involved in. So this first week is going to be broken out into 2 sessions. So you'll have an introductory session, and then you'll have the second session is going to be discussing the data management team. So on your discussion board, you'll have 2 sessions on there. Your first session is going to be involved in finding a research article about a medical indication that you're either interested in, or maybe you have a family member that suffers from it. But that assignment will be out there, and you guys can get started on that. For the data management team, we're going to discuss some of the roles that take place not only at the clinical site, but also with the sponsor or the CRO. So we'll get into a little more detail on that. Then as we get into week 2, we begin to get into some of the nuts and bolts that are associated with data management, such as creating case report forms, and also some of the database design issues and some of the edit checks that are used to clean the data as we go along. We'll also be discussing issues that are related to entering and reviewing data. And then as we move along to week 3, here we're going to get into our first lab. So that's going to be oriented around medical history, adverse events, and concomitant medications. We'll find that those pages in our data management database tend to be full of a lot of information that we can sometimes have some conflicts with. And then also in week 3, we're going to be talking about entering data on the CRF pages. We'll have some lab assignments on that. Then moving on into week 4, we're going to get into more of the data cleaning aspects of it, using the edit checks to do that. We'll have another lab session to go over that. Then in week 5, we're going to be talking about the clinical data management systems and also the electronic data capture systems. Some of you may be familiar with these. You may have used some of them in your work, depending on what your experience level is. Then in week 6, we're going to be discussing some of the coding dictionaries that occur that we use in clinical research, specifically the MEDRA and also the WHO drug dictionaries. We'll become familiar with those. Then also in that week, in week 6, we're going to get some information on some statistics. Many of the statistics that we use when analyzing clinical trial data, we'll go over some of those. We'll have have a webinar we're going to take a look at during that week. So I think you're going to find that to be very interesting. Then getting into week 7, we're going to get into some of the data management standards and organizations, specifically CDISC and CDASH. We'll go over those. We'll also have a discussion about scientific misconduct and how sometimes the data can reveal some of those issues that come up. And we're going to be looking at some interesting information related to that. Then finally in week 8, we'll wrap things up. We'll have our final test then and our final lab during that week. We'll also have a few, 1 or 2 guest speakers for our lab that I think you'll get a lot out of. So you'll want to participate in that. And then we're going to be wrapping it up with the study database lock and then what occurs after the database lock. So we're going to take the entire process all the way from the approval of the protocol and design of the database all the way through to the database lock. So a couple of our learning objectives for this particular orientation segment is going to be to discuss and understand the structure of a clinical trial. We're going to describe the drug development timeline and the phases of clinical trials and what occurs during each phase and why those phases are staggered the way they are. We're also going to look at and cite the participants of a clinical trial. Who participates? What do they do? And then we're going to discuss the clinical trial life cycle. So I think you'll find this segment to be very interesting. So what is a clinical trial? Well, the short answer is it's an experiment. A clinical trial is a research study in human subjects designed to answer specific questions about the use of a drug or device as a possible treatment therapy that generates safety and efficacy data. And we're going to talk about the difference between safety and efficacy data. So what we're attempting to do in our clinical trial is we want to generate a data set where our study drug has been studied in a population of patients, and then we want to take that data set and analyze it to determine whether or not our drug or device is safe and effective. And once we've done that and we're satisfied with that, then we want to submit that to a regulatory authority, such as the Food and Drug Administration, and have them approve it for marketing so that we can then go sell it to patients. The clinical trial involves a principal investigator who conducts the trial with oversight from an institutional review board. according to the study protocol, regulatory authority requirements, and good clinical practice guidelines. So a principal investigator is going to be a physician, a doctor, who in most cases is going to be working at an academic medical center or some other big medical facility where they do a lot of research. The trial is going to be overseen by the Institutional Review Board, which in many cases is going to be an adjunct of that medical facility. However, in some cases, it might be a central institutional review board. Central institutional review boards are for-profit companies that oversee research on behalf of sponsors and on behalf of doctors. And then they're going to do this in accordance to the study protocol. And we're going to talk about that a little later. That's going to be the document that explains everything that we're going to do, how we're going to conduct our trial. And then also with regulatory authority requirements. So in the case of the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, or in some cases, the National Institutes of Health, depending on what jurisdiction it falls under, is going to have certain regulatory requirements that we are required to abide by, and we're required to conduct the trial by. And then finally, we've got good clinical practice guidelines, which there are a number of those. The ones that you're going to be most familiar with that we're going to talk about some in our course here is going to be from ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization, and their good clinical practice guidelines, which are contained in E6 of their guidance. And we'll go over a few of those as we go along through the course. But these are guidelines that have been accepted by most of the nations around the world, so they're fairly uniform from country to country. Some of the regulatory agencies in certain countries will have additional requirements that we may have to be aware of and may have to follow. So it's important that we understand that. And then finally, the data collected by the principal investigator or the PI on behalf of the sponsor is submitted to the regulatory authority for approval to market the drug to humans within the regulatory authority's jurisdiction. And it's important to understand that even if a trial is being conducted under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, in many cases you may have clinical sites that are overseas, that are in Europe or South America or China. It's important to understand that the U.S. FDA still has jurisdiction even in those locations. So they can require that a principal investigator adhere to certain regulatory requirements, even though they may be outside the United States. This diagram explains the drug development timeline and basically provides a primer for how long it takes to get a drug to market. So if you look over on the left-hand side of our graph here, you'll see that we've got 0 to 12. That would be the time in years that you see there. And if you'll notice in the first portion of our diagram there, our preclinical testing occurs in years 0 to 3. So it takes about 3 years where we're testing our drug with animals in laboratories. This could be in vitro. It could be using larger animals. We might start out with small mice, and then we'll progress up to larger mammals. Primarily what we're trying to do is determine the toxicity of the drug. How much of a dose does it take to kill the animal? So essentially we're really looking to figure out at what dose does it kill half of the animals in our population. That gives us an idea of where the toxicity level is and where that may pertain to humans. So once we've begun to kind of test that and figure out where that is, then we can progress into our testing in human subjects. And we start out in phase 1. Phase 1 trials are conducted on healthy volunteers. We usually will have anywhere from 10 to 100 in a particular trial. And what we're trying to do is trying to figure out how the dosing is going to work. In many cases, these phase 1 trials are conducted in special facilities. We have some right around the triangle, right around here, where you'll hear of people going to the facility and they may spend the weekend there, spend a few days, they stay overnight, they're kind of sequestered there. You get a lot of college students, you get a lot of you get some indigent patients that participate in these. There are even people out there that actually make a living participating in these phase 1 trials. So what we're trying to do is figure out what doses are safe for people to take. Now, we're not trying to kill people in these trials, in these phase 1 trials, but we're trying to figure out, at what dose can they tolerate the medication. So once we complete the phase 1 testing, we're going to move in phase 2 testing. And in phase 2 testing, we're going to get a larger population of patients. These are going to be patients that suffer from the medical indications. So if it's heart disease or diabetes or asthma or whatever it may be, we're going to have specific inclusion-exclusion criteria for those patients, and we're going to get people that suffer from that disease indication. And then what we're trying to find out here, once again, we want to find out what the optimum dose is for the drug, but we also want to start to collect some of our efficacy data, because we want to see if our drug is actually benefiting these people, because after all, they do suffer from the medical indication. So once we feel satisfied that we've collected data and we feel like we can move to phase 3, at that point, we're going to expand it to a larger population of patients. This is where you're going to see multiple centers, in some cases, multiple countries involved in these phase 3 trials. They're going to be larger patient populations. And in these trials, we're going to introduce multiple treatment arms into our trials. So we may have, say, a blinded trial where we've got one population of patients getting the study drug, and then we've got another population of patients that are maybe getting a placebo, and we want to see how the data differs between the two. Or we may want to do some type of head-to-head comparison between our drug and maybe a drug that's already on the market. So we may see those in our phase 3 trials as well. We've got larger populations of patients. This is where we're really going to hopefully collect the data that's going to make it, give us a chance to submit this data to the regulatory authority, to the FDA, and hopefully they'll approve it. So this gives you an idea of the timeline required. And you can see it takes generally 11 to 12 years or longer for a drug to go through all of this testing, all of this series of research, before the drug is able to be approved to be given to patients. This graphic here illustrates the drug development timeline and adds a little variation to it. As you can see over on the left side, we still have our preclinical testing and research and development, and that can be anywhere from 1 to 3 years in duration. And then that column in the middle where you see the arrows that identify the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies, these are conducted over a longer period of time. And then you'll notice the smaller columns there in the middle. The NDA review, that is the new drug application. So once we've completed enough phase 3 trials that we feel like we have enough data to submit, we're going to submit a new drug application to the FDA. It's probably going to take them at least a year or more to analyze that. They're going to come back with questions. We're going to have a series of meetings. The statisticians are going to drive a lot of that, because they're going to want to assess safety and efficacy of our drug versus what we found in the other trials. And then once we get our drug approved, then we're going to go into what's called post-marketing surveillance. This is often referred to as phase 4 studies. And in phase 4 studies, these are done on drugs that are already approved already out there in the marketplace, being prescribed by doctors. What we're trying to do is further enhance the safety profile of that drug. We're trying to do our adverse event and adverse drug reaction reporting. We wanted to find if there anything new is happening out there, and then we're going to submit that data to the FDA as well. So this gives you a little variation on that drug development timeline. So let's talk about some of the clinical trial players, some of the key folks and key organizations that are instrumental in our trial. The first is going to be the sponsor. The sponsor is the company or entity that produces the drug or device that then stands to benefit financially from its successful approval. You know who many of the big drug companies are around the world. We've got Glaxo, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Merck. Many of you are going to be familiar with these drugs. You may be familiar with some of the products that they have, but the sponsor of the trial is going to be the drug company or the medical device company if it's a device trial that stands to benefit from the approval. The clinical site is going to be headed by the principal investigator. Remember, we talked about that in an earlier slide. The principal investigator is going to be a doctor, a physician, in many cases working at an academic medical center. The site enrolls patients or study subjects in the trial and then conducts the trial according to the protocol. So essentially the way it works is the sponsor essentially hires the doctor to conduct the trial. Now, they're going to be, in most trials, in your phase 2 and phase 3 trials, they're going to be multiple sites, multiple doctors. It's not uncommon, you may have a trial that has 30 or 40 or 50 sites or more, depending on its complexity, and they may be around the country, around the world, depending on how they have it set up. So the principal investigator is going to actually see the patients, administer the study drug, collect the data, and then provide that to the sponsor as they go along. A couple of the other clinical trial players, the Institutional Review Board, we talked about them earlier. The Institutional Review Board is responsible for the safety of human subjects. They oversee the PI and they approve the study protocol. They also approve the informed consent documents that are used to consent the patients, and also study materials that are used, such as dosing diaries or any advertisements that are used to attract patients for the trial. The IRB has to approve all of those documents. Anything that is presented before a patient or before the public, the IRB has to approve that. As I mentioned earlier on an earlier slide, we have local IRBs and we have central IRBs. Local IRBs are part of academic medical centers or some other medical entity. A central IRB is a for-profit company that oversees research for sponsors and investigators. There are a number of central IRBs around the country. We have several of them that operate right here in our area, and they can be large companies or they can be smaller companies. Just depends on what their capabilities are. But it's important to understand the difference between the two. One, the local IRB is actually a part of a larger medical facility, whereas a central IRB is a standalone company. A couple of more players here. We have the regulatory authority. That's going to be the government agency that regulates the approval, sale, and distribution of drug and device therapies. Examples of them: the FDA here in the United States, National Institutes of Health. We also have state and local agencies that may be involved as regulatory authorities with respect to a clinical trial. Of course, we have the patients. Those are the human volunteers, human subjects who volunteer to participate in the clinical trials. And then we have contract research organizations, or CROs. These are companies that administer and monitor clinical trials on behalf of a sponsor. So in many cases, you may have pharma companies, such as a Glaxo or a Pfizer or a Merck that may outsource the administration and the monitoring of the trial to a CRO. We're lucky that we have quite a few CROs here in our area. There are probably at least 20. The larger ones are Quintiles, PPD, Parexel, PRA, and then there are a number of smaller ones that don't get quite as much press. But basically, the CRO industry is headquartered here in the Triangle area of North Carolina. We have those four that I mentioned are the four largest CROs in the world. Quintiles is headquartered right here. PPD is headquartered in Wilmington. PRA is headquartered here in Raleigh. Parexel has a significant operation here locally in Durham, even though they aren't headquartered here. They still have a very large presence. This graphic shows us essentially in a nutshell kind of the process, the timeline, the sequence of events that occurs in a clinical trial. So if we start out in the upper left corner there, we have an approved protocol. So we've got a protocol document that explains how we're going to conduct our trial. These documents can be anywhere from 100 to maybe 200 pages, usually around that range is what they consist of. They explain all of the assessments that are going to be done, all the visits that are going to occur, how the patients are going to be selected, the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Anything that's going to take place in that trial is going to be discussed in that protocol. The next thing we're going to do after we've got our approved protocol is we're going to start to select our investigators. These are our principal investigators. Remember, they're the doctors that conduct the trial. So a couple of things that we're going to be looking for in that selection process. We're going to look for doctors that have participated in clinical trials in the past, that also have experience in the therapeutic area that our trial is being conducted in. You know, for example, if we have a cancer trial, we want to have doctors that are treating cancer patients. We don't really want to have doctors that are treating patients for asthma, or doctors that are just general practitioners. They would not be good selections for us for our cancer trial. On the contrary, if we are doing, say, a diabetes trial, we want to have doctors that are treating patients for diabetes. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for research experience, and we're looking for therapeutic expertise. So then we go through an approval process. We're approving the doctors that are going to participate in our trial. Not every doctor is going to want to participate. Some of them may have competing protocols, and that may limit their interest in participating. We're going to pay these doctors, and in some cases, some of the doctors say, well, you're not paying me enough money, so I'm not going to participate. So we go through this approval process, and then once we've got our doctors approved and they've got their IRB approval for their site, then they can start recruiting patients and having them participate in the trial. So the patients come in for their visits, the doctors conduct the visits, perform the assessments that we want them to perform of the trial, collect the data that they're going to provide to us, and then they start providing that. Okay, so then the data is going to be entered, and it's going to be reviewed by our staff at the sponsor, the pharma company, or it could be the CRO if it's outsourced to a CRO. So we're going to start reviewing that data, and we're going to start cleaning it. And a big part of what we're going to learn in this course is how we do that and how important that is. Once we have a clean data set, we're going to send it over to our biostatisticians. They're going to run their statistical analysis on our data. They're going to slice it and dice it and try to determine whether or not it reveals our drug was safe and effective. And then once we feel confident that we've done that, we're probably going to start presenting that data at some medical conferences. So we may want to present that at some medical conferences. And then once we've got our data ready, we're going to submit it for registration. We're going to submit it to the FDA for regulatory approval. Hopefully they'll approve it, and we can start selling it to patients and helping them out. This graphic explains the clinical trial lifestyle in a little varied attempt. We start over on the left-hand side with our light bulb going off. So we feel like we've got a compound that shows some promise. In the laboratory, we've done our animal testing, our preclinical testing. We feel like it has a lot of merit. So we develop our clinical trial plans and our protocol. So we write our protocol, we order our clinical trial materials, we develop a case report form or a database, depending on whether or not we're going to do an electronic data capture study or if we're going to perform the study on paper. We're going to prepare our investigator brochure. That's going to be a document that explains all of the science behind our compound. We're going to give these to the doctors. We're going to require that they read it. We're going to require that they sign a piece of paper saying that they read it. It's going to explain the preclinical testing that we've done. Any previous testing in humans is going to be listed in there. If we go look at our ICH E6 Section 7 regulation or guideline, excuse me, it discusses all the information that should be in our investigator brochure. So we're going to provide that to the doctors for them to read. Then we're going to get our protocol approved. We're going to start screening potential investigators. We're going to do some pre-initiation visits. So we're going to go out, we're going to visit their sites. We're going to make sure that they have a suitable site, that they've got all the resources they need in order to conduct our trial. We negotiate our budget. We conduct an investigator meeting where we might get all the doctors together in one location to discuss our trial, answer questions that they may have. Then we're going to select the investigators, and then hopefully we're going to go and conduct our trial and get everything approved to then get things rolling. So this graphic depicts the clinical trial lifestyle and a little bit of a variation. For you scientists out there, you probably remember the scientific method. So this sort of explains that or uses that as a mechanism for explaining the clinical trial life cycle. So we start out in our preclinical stage there at the lower left-hand corner. This is kind of the theory stage. So we're starting to develop our hypothesis to determine whether or not what we have is suitable. Then after we get through with the preclinical stage, we go into our modeling stage, which is our phase 1 stage. Here we're trying to determine our toxicity levels and learn a little bit more about how our drug behaves in the body, what it does to the body, what the body does to it. That would be our pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies that we do in phase 1. Then in phase 2, we start introducing our product into patients that already have the disease indication. So we're trying to determine, what doses are acceptable. We start to collect some of the efficacy data, start to see if it's being effective. Then we move on to phase 3, which is going to be our definitive trial and our model here. So then we're going to really expand it, increase the number of patients, get a good view of what the statistical analysis is starting to look like, kind of compare our drug with other treatment possibilities, either placebo or currently marketed medication. And then finally in the phase 4, we're collecting some long-term safety data. We're enhancing the safety profile of our product to make sure it continues to be safe and effective. So finally, this graphic depicts the scientific method. You probably remember some of this from being in school. With our scientific method, the first step is to ask a question. Second step is to state what we think our hypothesis is. Then in step 3, we're going to conduct an experiment to test our hypothesis. And then we'll analyze the results. Did it work? Did it not work? and then we form some conclusions based on what those results are. So a clinical trial operates in very much the same way. Clinical trials, and for the purpose of our diagram here, it mainly resides in steps 3 and 4, which is to conduct an experiment and to analyze the results. But it really touches all the different steps here in the scientific method. So in data management, what we're trying to do is clean the data so that it's free of errors, so that the data set can be as accurate as possible before we get to the analysis step, which you can see is in step 4 there. So it's important to understand that a clinical trial is basically a large science experiment. So we're trying to determine, is our product safe and effective? Let's collect data and determine if that's indeed the case. On the discussion forum for this week, the first thing that I want you to do is introduce yourself to the class. So tell us a couple of things about yourself. Tell us who you are. Tell us what experience you have in clinical research, if any. And then tell us where you work and where you live. If you want to tell us that, that'd be great. And also what you hope to get out of the course. I know some of you come at it from a variety of perspectives, so sort of let the class know what you're thinking in that area, and then maybe what your future plans are if you thought about that. So go ahead and get that out there as soon as you can this week. That's pretty simple. Anybody can go do that. It won't take you don't have to research anything. So go ahead and do that as well, and feel free to provide any personal information that you might want to, such as maybe if you have a family or maybe what part of the country you're from, or that kind of thing would be fine. And then finally, I want you to send me your contact information via email. I've gotten the email is listed there. So please send that out. We primarily want to know, what your email address is. And then also, I'd like to know what your physical address is so that we can mail your certificate to you, once you complete the course. So go ahead and get those done as soon as you can this week. Your assignment for the week is to find an article that discusses a clinical trial from a newspaper or some other news source, and then answer a couple of questions about it. Now, this will be very simple. I don't want anyone to feel intimidated by it. But what we want to know is what was studied and by whom. So what was studied is probably going to be the disease condition, and then by whom is going to be the pharmaceutical company or medical device company, or it could be a government agency, depending on who did it. And then what data did they collect? And then finally, what was the result that was reported? Did patients get better? Did they discover any connection between the drug and the result? Was there no result? Could be any number of things. It'll be easier to do this if you pick a medical indication or disease that you're familiar with. Maybe something that you suffer from, or maybe a family member suffers from. You don't have to reveal that necessarily, but you'll be a little more motivated to find the information if you have some kind of personal connection with it. And then go ahead and write that up. It won't take you but about a paragraph or two to answer those questions, and then go ahead and post it onto the discussion forum. You don't have to respond to anyone else. Just go ahead and do get that posted by the end of the week. In case any of you were feeling a little bit puzzled by the assignment for finding the article, I'm going to give you an example of one here that I think will help you understand a little bit more. This is a news story that appeared in the New York Times back in May 21st of 2013. So you can see that was nearly 2 years ago. And what it describes is a new asthma drug that was developed by Sanofi and Regeneron Pharmaceuticals that can help or may help patients whose condition is not well controlled by existing medicines, according to the results of a small clinical trial that they released earlier that week. So in a 12-week study, the number of asthma attacks for other outbreaks of symptoms decreased by 87% in those getting the drug compared to those that got a placebo. So other measures of lung function and disease control also improved. So according to the study results, which were published online Tuesday in the New England Journal of Medicine and presented at an annual meeting of the American Thoracic Society in Philadelphia. So I've included the link there at the bottom to the article that appeared in the New York Times. So if we take a look at what our assignment is, okay, what was studied? A new asthma medication, new asthma therapy. And who is it studied by? 2 pharma companies, Sanofi and Regeneron. What data was collected? If you look in the second paragraph, over a 12-week study, they collected the number of asthma attacks or other outbreaks of symptoms in the patients. So how many asthma attacks did they suffer from during that 12-week period? And then what were the results? Well, the result indicated that the symptoms decreased by 87% in those getting the drug versus those that got a placebo. So hopefully, and this is more than likely a double-blinded study, so the patient doesn't know whether they're getting the study drug or whether they're getting the placebo. So a decrease in symptoms of 87% is pretty significant. So it sounds like that we may be able to generalize that in a larger population of patients and point to some pretty decent results. So we might want to keep our eye on that drug, see if it gets approved at some point. As you go through this assignment, please make sure that you use some reputable news sources. I know there are a lot of websites and blogs and things like that out there, but what I really want you to look for is something that has appeared in a reputable newspaper or maybe on a television station someplace. That would be fine as well. So if you'll go ahead and do that, I don't think it'll take you very long to do it. Post your results, post your answers to those questions on the discussion board, and do choose a indication that you have some experience with or some prior knowledge of. I think you'll find that you'll get a lot more out of it. So at any rate, that concludes our first session for week 1. Go ahead and get things completed on the discussion board, and then move on to your second lecture later this week, which will be on the data management plan.